There are several aspects in chess strategy, chess planning in the opening, and one of the most important parts of chess strategy today is the pawn structure. Pawn structure is something that you design, in most of the cases anyway, in the opening. And then as middle game develops, of course, pawn structure can be changed, or you have to be able to vary, but first the planning for what you want, what will get you to desirable middle game. Let's look at a few games on good planning for pawn structure in the early stage of the game. Game between Petrosian and a Dutch international master. Game was played almost 30 years ago, but strategy and pawn structure, especially strategy of pawn structure, hasn't changed since. Knight f3, d5, g3, g6, bishop g2, bishop g7, white castles, black plays e5. Now we have some kind of variety of King's Indian with reverse colors. Now white is playing King's Indian. They call it King's Indian attack. But again, we don't want to make white comments of the opening. d3, knight to e7, knight b to d2, black castles, white plays e4, c6 for black, rook e1. And here black makes bad move. Bad move not in a way that it does some terrible damage, but inconsistent, and it's a bad planning for black. Black played here d4. It's okay to play this pawn structure for black, but then the obvious question is, why did they play c6 on a previous move? What's the point of protecting center with c6 if next move you're going to push the pawn? d4, but as I mentioned, this is not a critical mistake. So a4, a5 for black, and white played bishop to f1. This is an interesting move. What is the purpose of this move? Again, this move was played by one of the best strategists of the history of the game, Petrosian. So he played bishop f1. White is protecting d3 pawn because they are planning on playing c3 next move. So you see, if they play c3 with bishop on g2, then black will take on c3, and after white retakes with a pawn, d3 pawn is hanging. So that's why this is not possible to play c3 without bishop f1. After bishop f1, black played c5. That's another bad move. It's a bad management of the pawn structure by black. c4 square is weak. So is b5 square. So if white can occupy all those squares, and black is going to have really bad position on the queen side, weakening those light squares is very bad idea. So after c5, white played c3 as they planned, knight e2 c6, knight c4, and black played knight a6. Now we got to an interesting position where black has a dominating knight on c4. This is centralized position for the knight. And now the second part of the strategy, how to take advantage of it. If we had a choice to take any identical minor piece off of the board, what would it be? So white has number of outposts on white squares. So the ideal for white will be to eliminate light square bishops. Light square bishops. That will make knight on c4 more secure and will expose black's weaknesses on the queen side. On top of that, we have to mention that at this time, black's light square bishop is a much better piece than white's light square bishop. So move is h4. This move is designed to exchange light square bishops, something like king h2 and bishop h3. That's the idea. So Petrosian played h4, black played h6, white played h5. Of course, black does not want to take this pawn on h5 because after knight h4 creates a lot of weaknesses on the king side. Black played g5, and now the idea of exchanging light square bishops has to come true. How to exchange light square bishops? If white plays king h2, they are not going to be able to exchange light square bishops because of g4 move. So the way to do that is to play bishop e2, and after bishop e6, knight f to d2. Here's what white wants. They want to play bishop g4, and as we already mentioned, to exchange light square bishop. And I don't think black can do anything about it, because how to stop bishop g4? Queen d7 or queen ec8, they both lose immediately because of knight b6 forks queen and the rook. That's another reason why it was very bad to push queenside pawns and create those weaknesses on c4 and b5. Knight c7 by black, bishop g4, and this is a pawn sacrifice. Black played d takes c, b takes c, queen takes d3, bishop takes e6, knight takes e6. Let's talk about this position. Black has an extra pawn, but white is totally dominating on light squares, and they have every outpost in the center to go with it. After rook e3, queen to d8, rook b1. Now you see white has an open b file that they totally control. Absolutely perfect knight on c4, and possibility to double on b file, and black's knights have no single outpost. The bishop on g7 is really bad. So white's planning for pawn structure paid off. They put pawns on light squares, occupied with a knight central square, the c4 square, and exchanged light square bishops. Perfectly planned strategy, and white is practically now winning the game. Rook b1, rook b8, queen e2. Black has an extra pawn, but it doesn't feel like it, because there is the extra pawn on b7. It's absolutely useless. Queen e2, knight to e7. Knight to b6. Now it's nice to have centralized knight like on c4. Now it's time to take advantage of it. So knight goes to b6, queen c7, and here his brother is coming to c4. Knight c4, knight d to c4, rook f to d8, and knight takes a5. That took care of extra pawn for black. Black does not have extra material anyway. The pieces remain as bad as they were when they had an extra pawn. Knight c8, knight a to c4, knight takes b6, and knight takes b6. Here is the beauty that white had the c4 square that was very powerful. Now they also have d5 square. They can switch from c4 to d5 with a knight. Queen c6, a5. Before knight moves to d5, pawn has to be protected or just not be hanging. After a5, knight c7, bishop to a3. Now you see the c5 pawn is a target. Bishop f8, king to g2. That's one of those moves based on general principles that Petrosian liked so much, and Karpov as well. Bishop e7, knight c4, f6, rook b6. You see, you may tell, oh, white won because their pieces are a lot more active. That's true. That's why white won. But that was conditioned by the pawn structure and by the strategy white developed in the opening. After rook b6, queen a4, white played queen a2. You see there is a discover check opportunity for white. King g7, white played rook f3. Very nice move. Idea of rook f3 is to play possibly knight e3 and knight f5, getting in touch with black king, and also threatening knight takes e5 with the idea queen f7 check. So black made one more move, rook d7, and after knight takes e5, black resigned. This is a very well played game by white. Very simple. Well, let me show you why it has to resign, because after f takes e, queen f7 check, king h8, rook takes h6 is a checkmate. And this is very well played game by white and very poorly played by black. Now, I remember years ago I looked at games like this played by the best players in the world, best strategists in the world, and I was lucky enough in 90s already, playing in US Championship, playing game similar to the one we just saw, similar as far as the basic strategy goes. Game developed very differently. The resistance level was from black on a lot higher level, because my opponent was very famous Grandmaster Boris Gulko. Well, let's look at this game. The strategy was borrowed by me from the game I just mentioned. And the game continued like this. d4, it's a completely different opening, but you will see the similarity in closer to the middle game. d4, knight f6, knight f3, g6, bishop f4, bishop g7, c3, b6, e3. It's a very quiet opening for white. Bishop b7, h3, d6, knight b d2, castle, bishop e2. If you tell me now what is white's plan, I can't answer, nor anybody can answer here, because what white does, it's like a stage one completing development. Once development is completed, then we're gonna, depending on what the black's plan is, we will try to design counterplay by white. Normally it's the other way. White originates the play and black plays counterplay. But when this game was played, it was for me like must-win situation. I had to win the match, and it was U.S. Championship micro matches, and this was like decisive game. And I decided to play position where neither side has concrete plan in a very early stage. So let's see what happened after h3. d6. White played knight d2, we played that, black castled, and white played bishop e2. In this position, black plays c5, white castles, black plays knight bd7, and here, finally, white has a plan. The white goes a4. The plan here is to play a5, maybe queen a4, and develop pressure on queen side. On a4, the logical reaction is a6. That's what was played by Gulko. Now bishop h2, queen c7, and here comes the second stage of the plan. Now going queen b3 or pushing a5 will not do any good for white, because black simply plays b5, and white has absolutely no prospects for counterplay. So move is bishop d3. So we're trying to play queen e2 and e4 to get some possession in the center. Now we're going to see how it's going to develop to the similar position we just had in the last game we discussed. After bishop d3, rook f2, e8, e4. Now you can see that there's bishop on h2 and queen on c7 on the same diagonal. What I planned on doing is going e5 and try to put more pressure in the center. So the logical reaction for black is e5, and that's what was played. D takes e. Knight takes e5. And here I get rid of my bishop on h2 because it's not going to be important piece. After bishop takes e5 and d takes e, with this pawn structure, I don't need dark square bishop. I need the light square bishop, because the light square bishop is the one who will create serious problems for black. And in this position, I went queen e2. And black has serious problems. Here, Gulko told me even after the game that he did not realize how bad his position was. After queen e2, we see that white simply wants to pile up rooks on d file. Black has serious problems with a6 pawn. What to do with a6 pawn? Rook cannot leave a file because then bishop is going to take on a6. Pushing a5 pawn is very bad. We just discussed this like a few minutes ago, that white gets possession of b5 square and c4 square. So Gulko did not want to have these weaknesses, which is probably on any reasonable level, they are critical, probably fatal. So after queen e2, it's a serious problem for black. Black played bishop h6, rook fd1. Black has no plan, no counterplay. They can never push b5 and never lead with a rook on a8. Bishop takes d2, knight takes d2. Again, this pawn structure, a6, b6, and c5, totally frozen. Queen c6. Idea is to put, black wants to keep white's knight on d2, protecting e4 pawn. For example, f3 now is not a good idea because black's knight is going to come to h5, and black is going to have some counterplay on the king side. So move was played was knight c4. And you can see that black cannot take e4 pawn because just simply lose material. After knight takes e4, bishop takes e4, queen takes e4, and we do the general exchanges, and in the end, knight d6 move is going to win material. So this is not acceptable for black. So what black did in this position, they cannot take the pawn. And after knight c4, black played rook a to d8. But they took advantage of white's blocking this diagonal. But after rook a d8, this is kind of tactical shot with the idea of getting, the idea is get big positional advantage. I want him to push a5 and go back with the rook on a8. But why is it tactical? Because after knight e3, black cannot take the e4 pawn. This is interesting to notice, because if knight takes e4, white wins with a move like knight g4, threatening the check on f6, and black is in a lot of trouble. So what happened? Instead of knight takes e4, black plays queen c8. They have to protect a6 pawn. But now what happened? Black didn't want to keep rook on a8 because it's too big a piece to protect the pawn, but now they put the queen. Queen's mission on c8 to protect one pawn. It's a not very honorable mission for the queen. After queen c2, queen c8, king h2, bishop takes e4. Here, black did not want to suffer. They don't even have an active plan. So bishop takes e4 they played. That loses some material. Because bishop takes e4, knight takes e4, and now knight to d5. You can see that black's knight is hanging, and if knight moves, then knight f6 check. If knight moves, then knight f6 check wins the rook on e8. After knight d5, black played f5, and white played f3. And the matter of fact here that black is losing exchange. What happened here, black played knight g5, and after knight f6, king g7, knight takes e8 check, rook takes e8, king g1, e4, is trying to get some counterplay in the center. Queen e3 attacking the knight, h6. Black definitely does not have full compensation, or even half a pawn compensation. They are whole exchange. They are down full exchange. h6, f4, knight e6, rook d6. Now we have an open file, and both rooks come on open file. Queen c7, rook a to d1, rook e7, and here I saw the threat. The threat is knight d4. I saw this threat and I allowed the move knight d4, which gives back an exchange. I played g3, and after knight d4, played rook d1 takes d4. You see, I don't want to take with this knight with a pawn because my d6 rook is hanging. But I played rook takes d1 takes d4, cd, queen takes d4, king h7, queen takes b6. So redeeming the exchange, extra exchange to a position where I'm going to have extra pawn and two connected pass pawns with an easy win in the rook endgame. Queen takes b6 check, and this was necessary to play because on a move like queen c4, if black decides to keep queens on the board, then rook takes g6, and white has mating attack. So in the game happened queen takes b6, rook takes b6, rook d7, and now b4. So what is white going to do here? Just push all this queenside pawn with 3 versus 1, and black should not have sufficient defense. Rook d3, rook takes a6, rook takes g3, king f2, rook takes c3, rook a7 check, king g8, and b5. Now pawns are even, but b pawn is unstoppable, and black king on g8 is bad. So all this together makes black's position absolutely hopeless. Rook b3, rook b7, rook b2 check. We're going to go quickly through this part. Rook b3 check, king d2, and after rook a3, b6, rook takes a4, rook a7, rook d4 check, king e2, and after rook b4, b7, you see that next move white is going to play rook check, win the rook. Actually, black played few more moves, but we can stop right here. So what we can tell, the similarity about these two games is that white had, there was same pawn structure, same outpost on c4 with the knight, and sometimes this weakness of d5 square and the pressure on a6 pawn, they determined white's advantage, and that was the only similarity on in these two games. So when we talk about the pawn structure, of course, there are hundreds or maybe thousands of different varieties of pawn structure. So you cannot study them one by one. No, you have to use your judgment. You have to learn the basics, what it is based on. And here, let's look at the game that I want particularly talk about pawn structure between Kasparov and Timan. e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, d4, e takes d, knight takes d4. But now we're going to look at the pawn structure that may be not frozen, but they can change as game goes by. You have an advantage in a pawn structure, then game develops, and you're changing the pawn structure to get different type of advantage. We're going to look, this is very interesting and instructive game. Knight f6, knight takes c6, b takes c. This is variation that was adopted by Kasparov, and this is very, very old variation, and it's been forgotten, and Kasparov brought it back to life. Knight d5, after e5, queen e7, queen e2, knight d5, c4. This is again very well known theory. Knight b6, knight c3, queen e6, queen e4, bishop b4, bishop d2, bishop a6, and b3. Bishop takes c3, bishop takes c3, d5. So black is trying to develop some activity and put a lot of pressure on c4 pawn. You see the en passant, taking en passant is not good because white's queen is hanging. But now they are attacking white's king. So queen h4, d takes c. And of course white did not recapture on c4 because they will just lose a pawn. Kasparov continues simply developing. Bishop e2. What he wants to do, actually, he wants to castle quick and maybe start kingside attack. If they want to castle quick and start f4 and f5. So after bishop e2, white played knight d5, attacking the bishop. Bishop takes c4. And you see, if bishop will take on c4, then queen takes c4. And white has big advantage in pawn structure. The c pawns are very weak. Here Timman makes very creative move, g5, queen d4, bishop takes c4, queen takes c4. Knight f4, queen takes c6, and knight takes c6. Let's talk about this position. White has overwhelming advantage in pawn structuring. However, position is very, very difficult to win for white because black has a better minor piece. Knight on e6 is very secure and centralized. At the same time, bishop on c3 is not as good of a piece because pawn on e5 blocks bishop's activity. Now, if white could play pawn e5 to e4, then they would have easily won position because bishop is much better. Bishop may even have an outpost on f6, but pawn is on e5 and pawns don't go back, so white has to play this position. So what happened after a knight takes c6? White played castles long, king e7, rook h1. We're going to see very instructive. What is white's plan? White wants to play rook e4 and start bothering those pawns on the queen side. You see three weak pawns on a7, c7, and c6. a7, c7, and c6. They are all weak. Rook has an easy access to those pawns. After rook e1, rook h d8, rook takes d8, rook takes d8. And white goes on with their plan. Rook e4, rook d5, king c2, c5. Still very, very difficult to take advantage of this position. Rook a4, knight d4 check, and here is the interesting decision. All advantage white has is based on pawn structure. So we already mentioned these a and c pawns. After knight d4 check, white can move the king, then knight will go to c6. And you see these pawns are not so easy to access. White plays bishop takes d4, c takes d, and you see the black's pawn structure is now fine. It's just they don't have too many of those. They just lost one on a7, rook takes a7, king d7, and king to d3. Now this is totally winning position for white. And main reason position is winning is not that white has an extra pawn in rook ending. Let me tell you this, that if we can possibly generalize rook endings, well, rook endings you can write like many books about rook endings and still not to be complete. But if you can generalize, I can tell that most of the endings, when one side has extra pawn, majority of them are drawn, unless there are outside factors that are decisive. Here, white has an extra pawn, but that's not why they are completely winning. They have dominating king in the center, weakness on d4 by black, and more active rook. While ago, I made tapes on rook endings, and I mentioned that every ending, the rook ending or pawn ending or queen or bishop ending, they have one general principle. Each one of them has some general rules. And general rule in a rook ending is that white, the side that has an extra pawn, actually any side, even side that has is pawn down, you must have king active. Rule 2, you must have rook active. If you play rook, you much rather be pawn down with active rook or active king than have an equal pawn, equal material with the passive pieces. After king d3, white's king is a lot more active than black's king, and white's pawn a lot more active than white's rook, a lot more active than black's rook. So that's why it was okay for white to give up the pawn structure advantage that they gained in the early stage of the game and get to the winning end game. So the game of chess is not opening, it's not middle game, it's not an end game. It's all three of them together. You have to have good enough knowledge in all three of them to play full-scale, complete game. So after king d3, rook takes e5, rook a4, pawn c5, pawn b4. Now white breaks this pawn chain. King e6, rook a6 check, king f5, pawn goes to b5, and you see that white's b pawn is very, very dangerous. And again, why? Because white's king is very active and blocks connected pass pawns of black's. And black's king is not even close to block white's pawns. So that's why the game is over. And white has an extra pawn now, but if we took off h and g pawn, it may be over just as well. So white is not winning because they have an extra pawn. They're winning because they have very dangerous pass pawns. b5, rook d5, rook c6, c4, king takes c4. This is a small combination by black, d3, and black thinks that they are doing okay, because if king takes d5, then d2. That's what happened. The small combination, as a rule, ends well-planned game. d2, and there is a way for white to stop this pawn on d2. White played g4 check, and black has to take on g4 or play king f4, which doesn't make any difference because white is going to play rook c4 check. The next move, rook d4, black's pawn is stopped and game is over. Now this was good example how to take advantage of weaknesses. And weaknesses being created because the pawn structure was bad. White played on this pawn structure, and they've been creative to repair black's pawn structure for a cost of a pawn in rook ending, and then they won the end game. The next game we're going to see, it's very different from the games we just saw. There is not much about a pawn structure, but it's a lot about a pawn, one particular pawn. A lot of times we can see the positions where it's hard to determine. One side has isolated pawn, it may be a pass pawn. How do you differentiate between weak pawn and a strong pass pawn? This is a good example. Let's see a game between Spassky and Karpov was playing in the candidates match in 1974. E4, C6, D4, D5. Karpov is black. Knight C3, D takes E. It's a very well-known Caro-Kann defense. Bishop F5, Knight G3, Bishop G6, Knight F3, Knight D7, Bishop D3, E6, castles, Knight Gf6. It's not very exciting stage of the game where each side just develops and it's all theory. Knight Gf6, C4, Bishop D6, B3, black castled and white played Bishop B2, Queen C7, Bishop takes G6, Pawn takes G6. Queen E2, Rook F to E8, and Knight E4. Knight takes E4, Queen takes E4. Here we get the position that frequently, the structurally, you can have from various different kind of openings, like from Queen's Gambit declined, from Catalan, from and number of other openings. So Bishop E7 was played by black. Black wants, in some cases, to go Bishop F6, and to have this standoff against this, to neutralize White's B2 bishop. After Bishop E7, Rook A to D1, White continues bringing pieces closer to the center. Rook A D8, Rook F to E1, and Black played Queen A5. A3, and here Karpov played Queen F5. Black is still struggling for equality. Position is slightly better for White, but nothing alarming for Black. So Queen E2, Karpov played G5, H3, G4. Now, Black just wanted to exchange the double pawns. H takes G, Queen takes G4, and now we're getting to the critical stage of the game. White played D5. Now we're going to have some excitement here and some interesting strategical ideas. C takes D, C takes D. You can tell that if White plays E takes D, after Rook takes D5, they will experience some unpleasant pressure on E and D files. So Karpov played E5, D6, Bishop F6. And here is the pawn I was talking about. Pawn on D6. What is it? Is it a strong pass pawn? Or it's a weak isolated pawn? That's what the battle is about. Right now there is no visible. It's very hard to see how can White activate this pawn. But on the other hand, this is as hard to see how Black can take advantage and try to surround this pawn and win it. But there are rules about this position, some rules that are very important to know. Rule 1, Black does not want, white does not want to exchange queens. Because if you exchange queens, then king will be coming into the game. And black's king is a lot closer to the critical area, which is d6 pawn, than white's king. So after, now we get to the, after e5, d6, bishop f6. White plays knight d2. I severely criticize this move for the reasons I just mentioned. All of a sudden, white knight goes to d2, and they allow exchange of queens. Queen takes e2, rook takes e2, and the rook c8. Now I think I like black. I don't like this d6 pawn because I don't see how to activate it, and I don't know how to stop black from moving the bishop and playing f6 and coming up with a king. Very well played from now on game by black. Rook c8, knight e4, bishop d8, g4, f6, bishop on b2 totally neutralized. So white's bishop on b2 is looking into the wall, the shooting against the wall, this pawn structure, g7, f6, e5 pawns. King g2, king f7, rook c1, bishop b6, rook e2 c2, black exchanges rooks, rook takes c2, rook takes c2, king e6. Now you clearly can see that d6 pawn is a weakness, and it's a big, big weakness. And after king e6, a4, a5, bishop a3. It's well protected, but as pieces come off the board, you'll see clearer how this d6 pawn is weak. Rook to b8, rook to c4, bishop to d4. Now, you see there is only one open file, is C file. H file doesn't count because black cannot activate their rook. There are no squares to penetrate from to. So there's only one open file, and very difficult for black to take over. So that's why they are planning on opening another file by playing b5. That's the plan anyway. So white goes f4, and white realized here that they cannot wait any longer, because if black goes b5, and after white takes, rook takes b5, there is another weakness that is maybe even weaker than the d6 pawn. So white has to hurry with a play. f4, g6. The idea of g6 move, white wants to stop, black wants to stop white from playing f5 and kicking their king out. g6, knight g3, and black plays ef, rook takes d4, fg, king takes g3. Now we have this totally blockading knight and really bad bishop. Rook c8, also black takes over the file. Rook d3 and g5, bishop b2 and b6, bishop d4, rook c6. Pawn finally falls. Pawn fell like 27, 28 moves after it's been placed on d6. Rook c6, bishop c3, rook c5. There is no urgency to take this pawn right away. Rook c5, king g2, rook c8, king g3, knight e5, bishop takes e5, f takes e. You see, black plays like the pawn on d6 does not even exist, and it's not going to exist much longer. b4, e4, rook d4, king e5, rook d1, ab. We have everything we said about rook ending. We have active rook, we have active king, and if pawn goes to d7, rook d8, and black can just come back and take the d pawn, and they can win many different ways. Position is now very helpless for white. Rook b1, rook c3, check. King f2, rook d3, d7, rook takes d7, rook takes b4, rook d6. Black has very active king and an extra pawn. King e3, rook d3, king e2, rook a3. White resigned here because if they take on b6, black is going to take back on a4, and white does not have any defense against king f4 and king takes g4, which will give them 2 extra pawns, and game is over. So based on what we said, based on what we saw, we can say that pawn is, remember, pawn is the only piece in a chess that does not go back. So when you plan about the pawn structure, make sure that if you don't like what you structured, you cannot go back. So pawn structure is a very sensitive part of planning in a game. We're going to have a lot more examples to go over to see some other positions and varieties and ways to manage the pawn structure, which is going to be very, very instructive for you. Thank you.